The men sitting across the conference table couldn't stop laughing. To them, the man sitting quietly near the end of the polished oak table was invisible. He wasn't wearing an expensive watch. He didn't arrive with an assistant. He didn't command attention when he entered the room. In fact, nobody even stood up to greet him. As far as they were concerned, he was probably an employee sent to take notes, maybe an assistant helping prepare documents, or perhaps someone responsible for arranging refreshments before the real decision-makers arrived. The strange part was that the man never corrected them. He simply sat there, listening carefully as million-dollar projections flashed across giant screens and executives discussed a deal they believed would change their company's future. One executive leaned back in his chair and joked that they hoped the actual owner wouldn't be difficult to negotiate with. Another laughed and said they had dealt with enough stubborn founders to last a lifetime. The room erupted with amusement. The quiet man smiled politely, but said nothing. Minutes turned into nearly 20. Throughout the entire discussion, nobody asked for his opinion. Nobody introduced themselves to him. Nobody seemed interested in who he was. They spoke around him as if he wasn't even there. Yet every decision being discussed depended entirely on one person. Him. What made the moment remarkable wasn't the laughter. It wasn't the assumptions. It wasn't even the disrespect. It was the fact that every person in that room believed they understood exactly how power worked. They believed power announced itself through expensive suits, luxury cars, prestigious titles, and carefully rehearsed introductions. They believed successful people looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, and carried themselves according to rules they had created in their own minds. What they didn't realize was that the quietest person in the room was also the most important. Then something happened. One of the executives glanced at his watch and frowned. "We've been waiting long enough," he said. "When is the owner getting here?" The room grew quiet. For the first time all morning, every eye turned toward the man they had ignored. He calmly closed his notebook, folded his hands together, and looked directly across the table. What he said next would completely transform the atmosphere inside that room. The laughter disappeared, the confidence vanished, and several people suddenly wished they could take back everything they had said, because the contract sitting in front of them could not move forward without a single signature. His signature. What happened next left everyone speechless. But to understand how a room full of successful executives ended up laughing at the man who owned the very company they desperately wanted to do business with, we need to go back years earlier, long before the million-dollar deal, before the boardrooms, before the success, and before anyone knew his name. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The man sitting quietly at the conference table that morning was named Marcus Johnson. By the time this meeting took place, Marcus had already achieved something most entrepreneurs spend their entire lives chasing. He had built a thriving company, created opportunities for hundreds of employees, and established a reputation that stretched across multiple states. Yet almost nobody outside a small circle knew his face. That wasn't an accident. Marcus preferred it that way. Unlike many business owners who appeared regularly on podcasts, filled social media with photos of luxury vacations, or constantly reminded the world of their success, Marcus lived differently. He rarely gave interviews. He avoided attention whenever possible. Most people who did business with his company never met him personally. They dealt with department heads, executives, managers, and representatives. Marcus stayed focused on building the business itself. He cared more about results than recognition, more about growth than applause, more about creating something meaningful than being celebrated for it. Ironically, the very decision that helped Marcus remain focused would eventually create the situation unfolding inside that conference room. Because while Marcus preferred staying behind the scenes, the executives sitting across from him operated in a completely different world. These were men who were accustomed to being noticed the moment they entered a room. They wore expensive tailored suits. Their watches cost more than some people's monthly salaries. Their confidence filled every conversation. They had spent years climbing corporate ladders, negotiating high-stakes agreements, and sitting at the center of important decisions. In their minds, they understood success. They understood power. And most importantly, they believed they could identify both the moment they walked through a door. When they arrived for the meeting that morning, they expected to meet someone who fit their image of a company owner. They expected a grand entrance, a powerful introduction, a person who immediately stood out. Instead, They found Marcus sitting quietly at the table reviewing documents. And because he didn't match the picture they had created in their minds, they never considered the possibility that he was the owner. That raises an important question. Why didn't they recognize Marcus Johnson? After all, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't pretending to be someone else. He wasn't avoiding the meeting. He was sitting directly in front of them the entire time. So what prevented them from seeing the truth? The answer reveals something far bigger than a simple misunderstanding. It reveals how quickly people form opinions, how easily assumptions take control, and how often those assumptions are completely wrong. Another question remains. How did Marcus become the owner of a company powerful enough to negotiate a $1 million contract in the first place? Because Marcus wasn't born into wealth. He didn't inherit a business empire. He didn't come from a family of executives. Years earlier, very few people would have predicted this future for him. In fact, many people doubted he would succeed at all. Some believed his goals were unrealistic. Others believed he lacked the connections necessary to compete. A few quietly assumed he would eventually give up, like so many dreamers before him. They were all wrong. Then there's perhaps the most important question of all. What caused the executives to underestimate him so completely? Was it his appearance? His personality? The fact that he wasn't trying to impress anyone? Or was it something much deeper? Something that reveals how people often judge value before they understand it? And finally, there is the question every person in that conference room would soon be asking themselves. What happens when they discover the truth? What happens when the laughter stops? What happens when they realize the quiet man they ignored controls the future of the deal they've spent months pursuing? Will Marcus remember every joke? Every dismissive comment? Every assumption? Will he use his position to embarrass them the way they embarrassed him? Will he walk away from the deal altogether? Or will he do something nobody in that room expects? The answer begins years before that meeting ever happened. Years before executives waited for his signature, before $1 million contracts carried his approval, and long before anyone associated his name with success. Marcus Johnson was just another young man trying to find a way forward. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were limited and money was often stretched to its limits. His mother raised him alone. She worked long hours, accepted extra shifts whenever they were available, and did everything she could to provide stability in a world that rarely offered much of it. Marcus learned early that life wasn't going to hand him anything. There were no wealthy relatives waiting to open doors for him, no family business waiting to be inherited, no powerful connections willing to make a phone call on his behalf. If he wanted something, he would have to earn it. As a child, Marcus watched his mother leave home before sunrise and return exhausted after dark. He saw the sacrifices she made when bills piled up. He noticed the stress she tried to hide. More importantly, he learned an invaluable lesson. Complaining didn't change circumstances. Work did. While many of his classmates spent weekends relaxing, Marcus often found himself helping wherever he could. He carried groceries for neighbors, mowed lawns, cleaned properties, and accepted almost any opportunity to earn a few extra dollars. The work wasn't glamorous, but it taught him discipline. It taught him responsibility. It taught him that progress often begins long before anyone notices it. By the time Marcus reached adulthood, he had developed a reputation among friends for being dependable. If he committed to something, he followed through. If he accepted a responsibility, he completed it. Yet despite his work ethic, success didn't arrive quickly. Like millions of Americans chasing better futures, Marcus found himself balancing multiple jobs while trying to build a life. During the day, he worked wherever he could find opportunities. Some positions were temporary. Others barely covered expenses. None of them resembled the future he imagined for himself. Still, he showed up every day because quitting wasn't an option. When his shifts ended, another part of his day began. While others slept, Marcus studied. While others relaxed, Marcus learned. While others complained about circumstances, Marcus searched for ways to improve his own. Night after night, he sat at small desks in tiny apartments surrounded by notebooks, business books, online courses, and handwritten ideas. Some evenings he was so exhausted he struggled to keep his eyes open. Yet he continued. He understood something many people never fully accept. The life he wanted would require sacrifices the average person wasn't willing to make. Unfortunately, hard work doesn't guarantee immediate results. Marcus soon discovered that effort and opportunity don't always arrive at the same time. Applications were rejected. Interviews went nowhere. Business proposals were ignored. Potential investors declined meetings. Opportunities he desperately wanted often went to people with stronger connections. Again and again, he found himself hearing different versions of the same answer. No. No experience. No funding. No opportunity. No chance. At times, the rejection felt endless. What made it harder was how often people overlooked him completely. In meetings, his ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them. In workplaces, promotions frequently passed him by. In conversations, assumptions were made before he even had a chance to speak. Many people looked at Marcus and saw an ordinary man. Nothing special. Nothing remarkable. Nothing worth remembering. The truth was that Marcus had become accustomed to being underestimated. At first it frustrated him. Then it motivated him. Eventually, it became one of his greatest advantages. Because while others focused on appearances, Marcus focused on preparation. While others sought recognition, Marcus pursued growth. While others worried about being noticed, Marcus concentrated on becoming valuable. Every rejection became a lesson. Every setback became experience. Every disappointment strengthened his resolve. There were moments when giving up would have been easier. Moments when the safer choice would have been accepting an average life and abandoning bigger ambitions. But every time doubt appeared, Marcus remembered the example his mother had set years earlier. Keep moving. Keep working. Keep believing. Even when nobody else does. What nobody realized was that Marcus wasn't simply working toward another job. He wasn't chasing a promotion. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was quietly building something much bigger. Most people saw an ordinary man. They had no idea what he was building. By the time Marcus Johnson decided to launch his own business, he had already spent years watching other people control opportunities he believed could be created differently. He wasn't driven by greed. He wasn't chasing luxury. He wasn't trying to prove himself to strangers. Marcus simply wanted something he had never truly experienced before: ownership. Ownership of his future. Ownership of his decisions. Ownership of the results that came from years of hard work. The problem was that dreams are often expensive, and Marcus didn't have the resources most successful founders rely on. There were no wealthy investors waiting to back him. No family members offering startup capital. No hidden trust fund waiting to rescue him when things became difficult. What Marcus had was determination, a vision, and savings that disappeared far faster than he expected. The first months were brutal. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried consequences. One mistake could erase weeks of progress. Marcus rented the smallest workspace he could find. He purchased only the equipment absolutely necessary to operate. Many nights he sat alone surrounded by spreadsheets and invoices, calculating how long he could continue before money ran out. Sometimes the numbers looked encouraging. Other times they kept him awake long after midnight. The pressure was relentless because failure wasn't an abstract concept. Failure had a deadline attached to it. As word slowly spread about his new company, Marcus began pitching potential clients. He believed in the service he offered. He believed in the value it could provide. Unfortunately, belief doesn't always convince other people. Meeting after meeting ended in disappointment. Prospective clients smiled politely and declined. Decision-makers promised to follow up and never did. Some listened for a few minutes before losing interest entirely. Others questioned whether a small, unknown company could handle serious business. Marcus would spend days preparing presentations only to leave empty-handed. The rejection felt familiar. He had experienced it before. Yet this time felt different because every rejection carried financial consequences. Every missed opportunity meant another month of uncertainty. Every failed pitch meant another bill waiting to be paid. Then came the banks. Marcus knew growth required capital. New equipment required capital. Hiring employees required capital. Expanding operations required capital. So he walked into bank after bank armed with business plans, projections, market research, and confidence. He walked out carrying rejection letters. Some institutions believed the business was too new. Others considered the risk too high. A few suggested he return after proving himself for several more years. The answer changed. The outcome didn't. No, no, no. Each rejection forced Marcus to become more creative, more disciplined, more resourceful. Meanwhile, competitors weren't exactly welcoming. Established companies viewed him as irrelevant. Some openly dismissed him. Others laughed at the idea that a small startup could compete against organizations that had existed for decades. Industry veterans spoke confidently about how difficult the market was. how impossible growth would be. How many entrepreneurs fail within their first few years? Whether they intended to or not, their message was clear. Marcus didn't belong. At least that's what they believed. As months passed, the pressure intensified. Bills continued arriving with perfect consistency. Rent, utilities, equipment costs, insurance, operational expenses. The business consumed money faster than it generated it. There were moments when Marcus sat alone staring at financial reports wondering whether he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Fear became a constant companion. Not fear of hard work. He had never feared hard work. The fear came from uncertainty. The fear came from knowing he had invested everything he possessed into an outcome nobody could guarantee. There were nights when isolation felt heavier than the financial pressure. Friends couldn't fully understand what he was experiencing. Family members worried but couldn't solve the problem. Marcus carried the responsibility alone. If the company succeeded, the credit would belong to him. If it failed, the responsibility would also belong to him. Yet despite the challenges, something remarkable began happening. Small victories appeared. Tiny at first, almost easy to overlook. One morning, Marcus received a call from someone willing to become his first customer. The contract wasn't large. The payment wasn't life-changing, but it represented something priceless. Proof. Proof that somebody believed in the company enough to spend money on it. Proof that his idea existed outside his imagination. Proof that he was moving forward. That first customer led to another conversation. That conversation led to another opportunity. Then came the first real contract. Marcus still remembered signing it. Not because of the amount involved, because of what it symbolized. The business was becoming real. Weeks later, the workload increased enough that Marcus faced a decision he once considered impossible. He hired his first employee. It wasn't a large team. It wasn't a corporate headquarters. It was one person, one additional chair, one additional paycheck. But to Marcus, it felt monumental. For the first time, someone else's future partially depended on the company he had built. Slowly, momentum began replacing survival mode. Revenue improved. Client relationships expanded. Referrals started arriving. Growth remained gradual, but it was happening. The dream many people believed would fail was quietly finding its footing. Marcus still had challenges, still had doubts, still faced obstacles. But for the first time, the future looked slightly brighter than the past. And just when it seemed progress couldn't move any faster, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything. Then one opportunity changed everything. The opportunity arrived quietly. There were no headlines announcing it, no viral social media posts, no dramatic celebrations. In fact, most people never knew it happened. Yet looking back years later, Marcus Johnson would recognize that moment as the turning point. The client who entered his life through a simple referral became the connection that opened doors he had spent years trying to unlock. What began as a modest business relationship quickly evolved into something larger. The quality of Marcus's work attracted attention. That attention led to introductions. Those introductions created new opportunities. And for the first time since launching the company, growth started happening faster than Marcus could have imagined. One contract became two. Two became five. 5 became 10. The company that once struggled to attract customers suddenly found itself managing more opportunities than ever before. Revenue increased. Not overnight. Not magically, but steadily. Consistently. The numbers Marcus reviewed each month began telling a different story. The business was no longer fighting for survival. It was gaining momentum. The same banks that rejected him started returning phone calls. Potential partners who once ignored his emails suddenly wanted meetings. Industry professionals who had dismissed him began paying attention. Marcus remained cautious. He understood how quickly success could disappear. He refused to become comfortable. While others celebrated milestones, Marcus focused on the next objective. As revenue grew, so did the company. New employees joined the team. Additional services were introduced. Operations expanded into new markets. What started as a small business operating from a modest workspace gradually transformed into a respected organization serving clients across multiple regions. Every year brought new achievements. Every year brought new challenges. And every year Marcus became more committed to a philosophy that separated him from many entrepreneurs. Stay focused. Stay disciplined. Stay invisible. While countless business owners built personal brands online, Marcus did the opposite. He rarely appeared in public. He avoided interviews. He declined speaking engagements. He wasn't interested in becoming famous. He wasn't interested in followers. He wasn't interested in convincing strangers that he was successful. For Marcus, success wasn't something to display. It was something to build. As the company expanded, people frequently encouraged him to become the face of the business. Marketing experts recommended it. Consultants recommended it. Industry professionals recommended it. Yet Marcus consistently refused. He preferred allowing the company's work to speak for itself. No luxury car photos. No private jet pictures. No videos discussing wealth. No carefully staged displays of success. While competitors competed for attention, Marcus concentrated on performance. And strangely enough, the strategy worked. The company continued growing. New partnerships emerged. Major clients signed contracts. Respected organizations began seeking relationships with the business. The reputation became stronger with each passing year. Yet something unusual happened along the way. The larger the company became, the less people seemed to know about the person behind it. Many clients knew the company's name. Few knew Marcus Johnson. Competitors tracked the business closely. Most couldn't identify its owner. Industry insiders discussed the company's growth. Very few had ever met the man responsible for it. At first, this happened naturally. Later, Marcus intentionally encouraged it. He understood something valuable. Remaining behind the scenes gave him freedom. Freedom to focus. Freedom to observe. Freedom to see how people behaved when they weren't trying to impress him. The decision would eventually produce a situation far more revealing than Marcus could have imagined. Because while his company became increasingly influential, assumptions about its ownership continued growing. By the time the opportunity arrived, Marcus Johnson had spent years preparing for a moment exactly like this. The company had grown far beyond what anyone imagined during those difficult early days. Revenue was strong. Partnerships were expanding. New contracts seemed to arrive every month. Yet even with all that success, this opportunity stood apart from the rest. The deal was worth $1 million. For some corporations, that amount might not have been extraordinary. For Marcus, it represented something much bigger than money. It represented validation. It represented influence. It represented entry into a completely different level of business. The agreement would connect his company with one of the most respected organizations in the industry. It would create opportunities for expansion. It would strengthen the company's reputation. It would position Marcus's business alongside competitors who had once dismissed him as insignificant. Months of negotiations led to this meeting. Lawyers reviewed documents. Financial analysts examined projections. Executives exchanged countless emails and phone calls. Everyone understood what was at stake. This wasn't a routine contract. This was the kind of deal capable of shaping the future. Naturally, the atmosphere surrounding the meeting was intense. The executives arriving that morning treated the occasion with the seriousness it deserved. Luxury vehicles filled the parking lot. Tailored suits, designer watches, polished shoes, confident handshakes. Everything about their appearance communicated status and authority. These were individuals accustomed to operating in high-pressure environments. People who negotiated large contracts regularly. People who expected to sit across from equally powerful decision-makers. As they entered the building, they carried themselves with the confidence of men who believed they controlled the outcome. Meanwhile, Marcus arrived quietly. No luxury car. No personal assistant. No security team. No dramatic entrance. He parked his vehicle, walked into the building, greeted staff members politely, and headed toward the conference room, carrying a notebook. His clothing was professional but simple. Nothing expensive. Nothing designed to attract attention. Nothing designed to impress anyone. To Marcus, the meeting wasn't a performance. It was business. The conference room itself reflected the importance of the occasion. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. The polished tables stretched across the center of the room. Presentation screens displayed financial projections. Contracts sat neatly organized in front of each chair. Everything was prepared. Everything was ready. All that remained was final approval. Marcus entered early and selected a seat near the end of the table. He opened his notebook, reviewed a few details, waited. One by one, the executives arrived. At first, nobody paid much attention to him. That wasn't unusual. Marcus had experienced similar situations before. People often overlooked him. People often underestimated him. The difference was that this time, the consequences would be far more revealing. As introductions began, the executives greeted one another enthusiastically. Business cards were exchanged. Titles were mentioned. Achievements were discussed. Yet strangely, nobody introduced themselves to Marcus. Nobody asked who he was. Nobody asked why he was there. Instead, assumptions immediately filled the gaps. One executive glanced at Marcus before turning his attention elsewhere. Another nodded politely before continuing a conversation with colleagues. A third barely acknowledged him at all. Without asking a single question, they had already decided where he belonged in the room. Perhaps he was an assistant. Perhaps he worked in administration. Perhaps he was there to support someone more important. Whatever conclusion they reached, one thing became clear. They did not believe Marcus Johnson was the owner. And because they believed they understood the situation, they treated him accordingly. The irony was remarkable. The most important person in the room had instantly become the least respected. Marcus noticed it. Of course he did. How could he not? Years of experience had taught him to recognize subtle signals. The brief glances, the dismissive body language, the assumptions hidden inside ordinary conversations. But Marcus remained calm. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't announce his title. He didn't reveal his position. Instead, he listened. Sometimes silence reveals more about people than conversation ever could. As the meeting officially began, the executives became increasingly comfortable. They believed they understood everyone present. They believed they understood the hierarchy. Most importantly, they believed they understood Marcus. What happened next revealed exactly what they thought of him. The meeting continued, and with each passing minute, the assumptions became more obvious. At first, the disrespect was subtle. The kind of behavior people often excuse as an honest mistake. No introductions. No direct questions. No interest in Marcus's opinion. But as the conversation progressed, the treatment became harder to ignore. The executives spoke over him repeatedly. Whenever Marcus attempted to offer insight about the contract, someone interrupted before he could finish. When he pointed out a potential issue in one section of the agreement, an executive barely looked up from his documents. Another quickly changed the subject. A third dismissed the concern altogether. The irony was almost unbelievable. Marcus knew the details of the contract better than anyone in the room. He had reviewed every page, approved every revision, authorized every stage of the negotiation. Yet the people seeking his company's partnership treated his contributions as if they carried no value. Still, Marcus remained calm. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't remind anyone of his position. Instead, he listened carefully. Years of business experience had taught him something important. People often reveal their character when they believe there are no consequences. And at that moment, the executives believed exactly that. One executive leaned back in his chair and casually asked Marcus if he could make sure fresh coffee was brought into the room. The request wasn't aggressive. It wasn't shouted. It was worse. It was delivered with complete confidence. As if there were no possibility he could be anything other than support staff. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Marcus simply looked at him, then politely responded that someone from the staff would likely handle it shortly. The executive nodded without giving the exchange a second thought. He genuinely believed he had spoken to an assistant. Several people around the table exchanged amused smiles. None of them realized what had just happened. As discussions continued, the atmosphere became increasingly relaxed. The executives grew comfortable. Too comfortable. They joked among themselves. They laughed about previous negotiations. They shared stories about difficult entrepreneurs and company founders they had encountered over the years. At one point, one executive joked that business owners always believed they were the smartest people in the room. Several others laughed. Marcus smiled politely and remained silent. Then another executive glanced in his direction. "You've probably seen some interesting things working for these guys," he said. More laughter followed. The comment wasn't openly hostile, but the message was clear. They had already decided who Marcus was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. He wasn't important. He wasn't influential. He wasn't someone whose opinion mattered. The room continued moving forward as though he barely existed. Each joke, each dismissive glance, each assumption added another layer of tension. Because unlike the executives, the audience knew the truth. The viewers knew Marcus wasn't an assistant. He wasn't support staff. He wasn't an intern. He wasn't there to take notes. He owned the company. Every minute that passed increased the anticipation. Every careless comment pushed the story closer to its inevitable turning point. And yet Marcus refused to reveal himself. That was perhaps the most remarkable part. Most people would have corrected the misunderstanding immediately. Most people would have demanded respect. Most people would have used the first opportunity to announce who they were. Marcus did none of those things. Instead, he watched, observed, listened. He wanted to understand exactly how these executives treated people when they believed those people had no power. The answer wasn't encouraging. As the meeting entered its final stages, the executives began discussing implementation timelines and approval procedures. They spoke confidently about what would happen after the owner arrived, what changes would be made, what expectations would be set, what agreements would be finalized. The entire conversation revolved around a person sitting only a few feet away, yet they remained completely unaware. Then something happened. One executive checked his watch. Another looked toward the conference room door. A third flipped through the contract and frowned. The room suddenly realized something. The person they had been waiting for still hadn't arrived. The owner. The individual whose approval they needed. The man whose signature would determine whether the million-dollar deal moved forward. A brief silence settled over the room. Then one executive asked a question that changed everything. The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, almost innocent. Yet within seconds, it would completely transform the atmosphere inside the room. One executive glanced toward the conference room door and checked his watch again. Another adjusted his tie and looked frustrated. A third flipped through the contract for what felt like the 10th time that morning. Finally, the executive sitting closest to Marcus spoke. "So when is the owner joining us?" The room fell quiet. For the first time since the meeting began, nobody was talking over one another. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was sharing stories. Everyone seemed to be waiting for an answer. The irony was almost unbelievable. For nearly 20 minutes, they had been discussing the future of a million-dollar deal with the owner sitting directly in front of them. Yet they still hadn't realized it. Marcus sat silently for a moment. Not because he was angry. Not because he was trying to create drama. But because he understood that certain moments don't need to be rushed. Sometimes the truth speaks loudest when it arrives calmly. He slowly closed his notebook. The soft sound echoed through the conference room. Several executives turned toward him. For the first time all morning, they were actually paying attention. Marcus folded his hands, looked around the table, made eye contact with each person who had ignored him, each person who had spoken over him, each person who had assumed they understood exactly who he was. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, professional, completely controlled. "He's already here." For a moment, nobody reacted. The executives looked around the room. Some glanced toward the door. Others exchanged confused expressions. A few appeared genuinely unsure whether they had heard him correctly. One executive even turned slightly in his chair as though expecting someone else to emerge from another room. The silence became uncomfortable. Nobody understood what Marcus meant. Then Marcus stood. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just calmly, confidently. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and having nothing to prove. Several executives watched him with puzzled expressions. Their confusion was growing by the second. Marcus extended his hand across the table. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he said. Another brief pause followed. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. "I'm the founder and owner." Silence. Absolute silence. The room froze. It was as though time itself had stopped moving. No laughter. No conversation. No movement. Nothing. The executives stared at him. At first, the words didn't seem to register. Their minds searched for another explanation. Another possibility. Another interpretation. Anything that made more sense than the reality unfolding in front of them. But there wasn't one. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't an employee speaking on behalf of someone else. This was Marcus Johnson, the founder, the owner, the man whose company they had spent months trying to partner with, the man whose approval they needed, the man whose signature sat waiting on the final page of the contract, and the man they had mistaken for support staff. One executive blinked repeatedly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Another lowered his eyes toward the table. A third looked completely speechless. The confidence that had filled the room earlier seemed to disappear instantly. In its place came something very different. Embarrassment. Because suddenly every comment returned to them. Every joke. Every interruption. Every assumption. Every dismissive glance. Every moment they had treated Marcus as though he didn't belong. Now those moments felt impossible to ignore. The executive who had asked him about coffee shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another remembered speaking over him multiple times. Someone else recalled the jokes about business owners. What seemed harmless minutes earlier now felt painfully different. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew how to recover. The room that had been full of certainty was now filled with disbelief. Marcus remained calm. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't enjoying their discomfort. In fact, his expression barely changed at all. That may have been what unsettled them most. The executives expected anger. They expected confrontation. Perhaps even humiliation. Instead, Marcus simply stood there with the same quiet confidence he had carried into the room. The same confidence they completely failed to recognize. For years, people had underestimated him. For years, people had judged him before knowing his story. For years, people had mistaken humility for weakness and silence for insignificance. Yet none of those experiences prepared the executives for what they were feeling now. Because in a matter of seconds, the entire power structure they imagined had collapsed. The assistant they ignored was the owner. The quiet man they dismissed controlled the future of the deal. And the person they respected least had become the most important person in the room. The laughter disappeared instantly. What happened next would reveal even more about Marcus Johnson than the success that brought him there. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. The room remained frozen beneath the weight of realization. Every executive sitting at that conference table understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. They had been completely wrong. Not about the deal. Not about the company. About Marcus Johnson. The audience expects revenge at this point. After everything Marcus experienced throughout his life, it would have been easy to understand. Easy to justify. Easy to cheer for. After all, he had spent years being overlooked. Years being underestimated. Years watching people judge him before learning anything about him. And now the men who had laughed at him were sitting silently across the table, waiting for his next move. One sentence could embarrass them. One decision could end the deal. One moment of anger could give them a lesson they would never forget. But Marcus Johnson had learned something long ago. Success isn't measured by how you treat people when you need them. It's measured by how you treat people when they need you. The executives waited. Marcus looked around the room. Then he did something nobody expected. He sat back down, opened the contract, and continued the meeting. No speech. No lecture. No attempt to embarrass anyone. No desire to settle old scores. Just professionalism. The reaction was immediate. Several executives visibly relaxed, though the embarrassment remained written across their faces. One executive cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Marcus, I think we owe you an apology." The room became quiet again, this time for a different reason. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. What remained was honesty. Another executive nodded. Then another. The apologies were genuine. Not because the deal depended on it. Because they knew what had happened. They had made assumptions. They had judged a man they didn't know. And they had been forced to confront that mistake in the most uncomfortable way possible. Marcus listened. He didn't make them struggle. He didn't force them to repeat themselves. He didn't remind them of every joke or every dismissive comment. He simply nodded, accepted the apology, and moved forward. That decision revealed more about Marcus than any business success ever could. Because character isn't revealed when life is easy. Character is revealed when you finally have the power to retaliate and choose not to. The meeting resumed. The discussion returned to the contract. Questions were answered. Final details were reviewed. Terms were confirmed. Yet the atmosphere had completely changed. The executives were no longer speaking to someone they assumed was beneath them. They were speaking to Marcus Johnson, the founder, the owner, the man who built everything from the ground up. The man whose journey began with a single mother working long hours to provide a better life. The man who endured rejection after rejection. The man who spent years building his company while nobody was paying attention. The man they almost failed to recognize. Eventually, only one thing remained. The signature. The final approval. The moment that would determine whether months of negotiations became reality. Marcus picked up the pen. The same pen that only hours earlier represented a routine business formality. Now it represented something much bigger. Not victory over the executives. Not revenge. Something far more meaningful. Proof. Proof that perseverance matters. Proof that discipline matters. Proof that character matters. Marcus signed the contract. The $1 million deal was official. Hands were shaken. Documents were exchanged. The meeting came to an end, but nobody walked out of that conference room as the same person who entered it. The executives arrived believing they could identify success simply by looking at someone. They left understanding how dangerous that assumption can be. Marcus left with something more valuable than a contract. He left with confirmation that the principles guiding his life had been right all along. Work hard. Stay humble. Let results speak louder than appearances. Because the most powerful people in the room aren't always the loudest. The most successful people don't always look successful. And the biggest mistake anyone can make is assuming they know someone's worth based on appearances. The men who laughed at Marcus entered the room believing they were meeting an assistant. They left knowing they had been sitting across from the man who owned the entire company. And now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked, where you came from, or what others assumed about you? Share your story in the comments below.